His entire string vanished in a storm. It reappeared behind a stranger's saddle. The rope was still on the saddle horn when I rode back into Cutter's Bend. I'd taken it off a dozen times during the 3 weeks I was gone, told myself to throw it in a creek, and every time I'd coiled it back up and tied it down again. I don't know why. Maybe I just needed something to look at that proved what had happened to me was real. A rope is a real thing. It has weight. It has smell. And that one still smelled like the oak branch they'd run it over, still had the bark dust pressed into the fibers from where it dragged. I rode in at first light because I didn't want to be seen, and then I got annoyed at myself for that, for coming back to my own valley like a man who'd done something wrong. Which is what they all believed. Which is what half of them still believe, I'd wager, even now. Men like Lester Boone don't get prosecuted in a county they've worked for 20 years without leaving some people who still half believe the story he told, because believing he lied means believing they went along with it, and that's a thing people don't warm to easily. So I rode in quiet, came down the ridge road in the gray before sunrise, the cold working through my coat at the collar, the horse picking his way careful on the frost-hard ground. My own ranch gate, my own fence line, my own particular way the cottonwoods on the east edge look at that hour, just shapes in the dark, shapes I knew without being able to see them clearly. I'd been looking at those trees every morning for 11 years. Let me back up, let me tell it right. I'd been running horses in the Cutter's Bend Valley for 11 years by the time any of this happened. Built up a string of 23-quarter horses, 4 of them mares with good lines, 1 stud worth more than my land. Dun-colored most of them, with that particular conformation you get when you're careful about it, short cannon, deep through the heart girth, hooves that didn't chip. I knew every one of those animals by a mark or a habit. The big gelding with the notch in his left ear from a fence wire incident his 2nd year. The gray mare who pinned her ears the second you cinched the girth too fast, and would stand dead still otherwise like a horse twice her age. A bay with a white sock on the off fore and a tendency to drift left on a loose rein, which I'd been working on. The young stud, barely 2, who paced the fence line at dusk like he was counting something. Every morning I'd come out and count them and they'd count me back. 23 horses, 11 years, that's what I had. The storm came out of the northwest on a Thursday in late October, and it came fast, the kind that drops the temperature 20 degrees before the first cloud even reaches you. I had a feeling in the morning, the way you get after enough years watching weather come in over the same ridge line. Something in how the light sat flat on the grass without warming it. I'd gotten the mares into the lower corral by noon, had the barn doors latched and the water troughs checked, and I was coming back across the east pasture to get the geldings when it hit. I mean it hit not rain first, not wind building, but a wall of cold and sideways sleet that turned the world gray and closed in about 40 seconds flat. I couldn't see the tree line. I could barely see the ground under my horse's feet, and I'd been standing on that ground for 11 years. I got the first 4 geldings by voice. Called them, and they came to me the way a horse will when it's scared and it trusts you, heads low, necks stretched, crowding each other as they walked. I walked them in. Came back for the others and the pasture was empty. I walked the fence line in both directions in that sleet with a lantern that kept threatening to go out, calling each one by name because they know their names, and there was nothing. No sound except the sleet hissing in the grass and my own heartbeat. The gate on the east side had blown open old latch. I'd been meaning to replace it since August, kept putting it off, which I have thought about many times since, and whatever had gone through it had gone a long way because I found no tracks. Sleet covers tracks. Sleet and mud together make it worse, and by the time the storm broke and I could see anything, there was 6 hours of darkness behind it. I lost 15 horses that night. I spent 4 days looking. Rode every draw, every creek bottom, every stretch of open grass in 20 miles, the kind of riding where you stop thinking about what you're doing and your body just does it. Checking ground, reading mud, looking at brush for hair caught on thorns that would tell you direction and recency. I got onto ridges where I could see far, and I stood there in the cold and looked. I talked to every spread in the area, asked if anyone had seen horses drifting through or found tracks on their land. 2 of them came out to help me look for a day, which I haven't forgotten. Found one of the young mares down in a gully with a broken leg, which I won't describe, just that it was hard and necessary, and I didn't hurry away after. That took some time by itself, the kind of time you give an animal you've cared for. Found nothing else. No horses, no tracks worth reading, no reports from any neighboring spread of strays coming through their land in the days after the storm. On the 5th day I came in off the range, unsaddled, put everything away properly the way you do when you're running on pure habit, and sat down on the porch with my boots still on, because I was too tired to take them off. I wasn't thinking about anything particular. I was just sitting there watching the gray afternoon and trying to decide if I had energy left to eat before dark. That's when I saw the dust coming up the Cutter's Road, 3 riders. Lester Boone, who ran a cattle spread 2 valleys over and had been wanting my east pasture since before I'd finished building the house, and 2 men I didn't know. One of them was wearing a deputy's badge. The other one was thicker, older, wore a coat that hadn't started life as his. Lester didn't get off his horse. He sat up there with his hands crossed on the saddle horn and told me, not asked, told me, that 11 of my horses had turned up on his land, out on the open range east of his fence line. That his man had spotted the Raftersea brand on them 3 days ago, and he'd reported it to the county sheriff as stolen property found in the vicinity of the Reese spread, and that the deputy was here to take my statement before taking me in to speak to the sheriff properly. I said, "They're my horses. They got out in the storm." Lester said, "The sheriff will sort that out." I said, "They've got my brand on them, Lester. That's not a question I need a sheriff to answer." He said, "That's the question, isn't it?" Then he looked at the deputy and said nothing else. I didn't understand that. Not then. Not the way he said it, not as a real question but as a conclusion. I should have pushed harder right there, gotten specifics, not let them walk me off my own land before I'd had the chance to look at what he was claiming to have found and where he'd found it, and when exactly his man had spotted them. But I was tired. 4 days tired. The kind of tired that doesn't just sit in your muscles but sits behind your eyes, and I was stupid enough to think that if my horses had my brand on them, the rest was a conversation that would get sorted in an afternoon. It wasn't an afternoon. In town, the county sheriff man named Odell, whose working relationship with Lester Boone went back a long way and sat comfortably, showed me photographs taken of the horses Lester's men had collected. Daguerreotypes, not clean ones. In them the brands were wrong. Not Raftersea, something else. Something close enough that you'd have to look, but different on close inspection. The bottom bar of the C was altered so it read more like a G or a smeared O, depending on the light. And Odell said, "These horses were found on open range bearing altered brands, and their description matches a report filed 3 months ago by a man in Dunmore County reporting stolen stock." I said, "Let me see those horses." He said, "They're evidence. They can't be touched until this is resolved." I said, "I want a lawyer." He said, "That's your right. The judge will hear it in 3 days." They put me in a back room of the county building, not a proper cell, just a room with a wooden door and a bolt on the outside, and a window that looked at the side wall of the dry goods store. 2 deputies sleeping in shifts. One of them, the younger one, brought me my meals without meeting my eyes, which I noted because it meant he knew more than he wanted to, or believed less than he was supposed to. 3 days in that room. I slept some. The younger deputy brought meals without meeting my eyes, which I've already said, but I also watched the way he moved, quick, head down, like a man trying not to be in the room he's in, and I made note of it. A man who won't meet your eyes when he brings your food either knows you're innocent or knows exactly what's been done to you and can't say so. Either way, it meant the machinery had moving parts that weren't all comfortable with themselves. I went through it in my head, every angle, every direction, every piece of what had happened in the order it happened. I'm the kind of man who, when something goes wrong, needs to trace it back to where it started, not to find someone to blame, though that's useful too, but because I can't sit with a thing I don't understand. So I went back as far as I could go, and I laid it all out in order, and I walked through it forward. And I kept arriving at the same place. Lester Boone had been waiting for a chance. Maybe he'd been planning it longer than the storm. Maybe he'd had a man watching my east fence for the right conditions, watching the latch I'd been meaning to replace, watching where my east pasture horses were grazed, and in what weather, or maybe the storm just handed him the moment and he took it. Either way, got to my horses before I could, had someone with an iron run over the brands on the 11 they'd collected, and then reported them as stolen from some man in Dunmore County, who was either a name on a piece of paper or a man who didn't know his name was being used for this. The brand registry alteration was the part that took me longer to arrive at, and when I did, I sat with it a long time. Because altering a county registry sketch isn't a thing you do in a hurry. You have to get into the record books. You have to know which page, which line. You have to do it carefully enough that it reads as original on first look. And you have to do it far enough in advance that it doesn't draw attention at the time of the crime, not 2 days before, not the week of. Months before. Maybe more than months. That meant someone, Boone or whoever he'd hired for the careful parts, had been in that registry office sometime before the storm, before October, working with a fine pen on a line in a book under some pretext. A routine inquiry. A clerk who looked away. Someone inside who looked away on purpose. That third day I thought about the clerk Peake who'd been sweating when I came to him. I thought about the deputy who wouldn't meet my eyes. I thought about how many men in a county the size of Cutter's Bend know each other and know each other things, and how few of them would have the spine to walk into a courtroom and say, "This is wrong and I'll say so." And I wasn't angry about it, or not only angry. Mostly I was calculating. I needed someone outside that web. Someone who had no reason to be inside it, and no favors owed to anyone in Cutter's Bend. The hearing was not what I would call a hearing. Odell testified. The man from Dunmore County testified, a man I'd never laid eyes on before, who described horses that could have been any dun quarter horses in the territory with a brand that read something like a C. Lester Boone's ranch foreman testified that they'd found the animals drifting on open range between Lester's east fence and my property line, early in the morning 4 days after the storm. My lawyer, a young man from Benton named Whitfield who looked like he was trying to grow a mustache for the first time and hadn't decided yet if he had the face for it, said that my horses had gotten out during the storm through a broken latch gate, and I'd been searching for them. The judge said that was the defendant's claim, and that the brand records were the brand records. The brand records, that was the piece I hadn't seen coming. Odell had gotten to the county brand registry. The Rafter C entry had my name and my land description and my registration date, 11 years back, but the brand sketch in the book had been altered. Some careful hand, not rough or hasty, careful with a thin-edged tool or a fine pen, had changed the bottom bar of the C just enough. The G or the smeared O. And I was sitting in that courtroom looking at the altered sketch in the judge's hand and understanding, for the first time, the full scope of what had been built against me. Not grabbed in a hurry, not improvised, months in the making. Someone had altered that registry sketch months before the storm, months before any of this, and had been waiting for the moment to use it. I was convicted of horse theft. 15 horses, the 11 that had been collected, and 4 more that Odell alleged were missing from a connected theft the previous spring, which was entirely fabricated but which I couldn't disprove in that room with that judge and that prosecutor. Sentenced to 60 days hard labor, and a fine I couldn't pay without selling the land. I am 62 years old telling you this. I was 58 then. And I want to tell you what it is to hear a sentence like that in a courtroom you've been sitting in for 2 days listening to your life get narrated back to you wrong. It's not what you expect. I expected anger, and there was some of that, but anger came later and kept coming back. What I felt first was loneliness. The deep, particular loneliness of looking around a room and there not being one face that knows you, not one man who stands up, not one voice that says, "I know Callum Reese, I've known him 11 years and this is false." Just a row of faces that either believed what they'd been told or had already decided to stay out of it, which comes to the same thing in the end. My lawyer Whitfield filed an appeal immediately. The judge, same judge, gave me 21 days while it was considered, released on my own recognizance, which meant they knew I'd go back to my land and stay because where else was I going to go? I went back. I couldn't sleep in my own bed that first night. I lay there listening to the horses in the corral and the sound of the house settling in the cold, and I went through it again, everything I hadn't done that I should have done, all the places where I'd trusted that things would be obvious and straightforward and they hadn't been. But then I stopped doing that. It wasn't useful and it was wearing me out, and I was going to need what was left of me. So I got up before dawn, made coffee, and sat at the table with a blank piece of paper and started writing down everything I knew about my original brand. The measurements, as best I could remember them from when I'd had it made, I'd watched the iron being fashioned, had specifications in mind, knew the C was supposed to have a longer top bar than most, the angle of the spine, the serif cut on the top bar that came from the particular way the smith had finished it. Things I'd never written down because you don't write down your own brand, you just know it, the same way you know the sound of your own front door. I wrote it all down. Then I went to the barn and looked at my remaining mares. The gray mare. She'd been branded at 2 years old by her previous owner, a man named Proctor who'd sold her to me when she was 4, and her original brand, Proctor's Mark, had been put over with mine at the time of purchase, a clean overbranding. The overbranding was 6 years old now, maybe 7, and the brand I'd put over Proctor's was mine, my raftersea with the long top bar. I could see it clearly in the gray coat, even with winter growth coming in if I got my hand in to press the hair flat. My brand was not the same as the altered sketch in the registry. My C had a top bar that extended a 1/4 inch longer than what Odell's alteration showed, maybe 1/3 of an inch, not a thing you'd notice at distance, a thing you'd notice if you were looking for it. I had a horse that could prove the discrepancy, if anyone was willing to look. I took that mare to town and to 3 people over 2 days. The first was Garrett, who ran the feed merchant and had done business with me for 11 years. He stood outside his store and looked at the mare and looked at my notes and told me he was sorry, but he couldn't get involved in anything to do with the sheriff's office while Odell was still in his position. He said he had a family, and I could understand that. I could understand it, I didn't like it. The second was the land recorder's clerk, a thin man named Peake who filed everything that came through the county offices and knew where most of the local records lived. He told me that brand disputes were a matter for the courts, that he couldn't examine a horse on official business without a court order, and that he would note my visit in the log as required. He was sweating when he said it, which told me he knew something and didn't want to be seen knowing it. The third was a woman named Nora Aldred. She ran a spread on the north end of the valley, mid-sized place, cattle mostly, a few horses. Her husband had died 2 winters back, a fever that took him in less than a week. She'd kept on running the spread herself without selling or moving, without remarrying in the way that seemed expected of a woman alone on a working ranch. People in town had different opinions about this depending on who you asked. I didn't have a particular opinion about it. She'd struck me, in the few times we'd spoken at town meetings or at the feed merchants, as a woman who listened more than she talked, who said what she meant when she said it and didn't bother with what she didn't mean. I'd always thought that was a quality worth noting, and then mostly forgotten about it until someone in town mentioned that she dealt extensively with the brand recorder's office the previous spring, getting her late husband's cattle brands transferred into her own name. Complicated enough process that she'd have to know how it worked. I rode out to her place on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days into my 21. I hadn't sent word ahead. I tied the gray mare at her gate and knocked at the door, and when she opened it I said, "I'm sorry to come without warning. I need some information about the county brand records, and someone said you'd navigated that office recently." She looked at me for a second, then she said, "Come in out of the cold." Her kitchen was warm and clean, wood stove going, a rifle hanging on pegs above the door, which I noticed, not because it was unusual in a ranch house, but because of where it was hung, where she'd reach it fastest from the most likely direction. Coffee pot on the stove, a stack of ledger books on the end of the table with a pencil laid across them like she'd been working. I stood at her kitchen table and told her everything, all of it. I went through it in order: the storm, the lost horses, Lester Boone riding up to my gate, Odell, the hearing, the altered registry sketch, the Dunmore County man I'd never seen, the conviction, the appeal deadline. I didn't skip the hard parts or soften the sequence. I laid my written notes on her table and let her look at them while I talked. When I was done, she didn't say that she was sorry or that it was terrible or ask how I was holding up. She looked at my notes for a moment and asked 2 questions. The first, the brand on the gray mare, is she here or at your place? I said, she's outside at the gate. The second, is the appeal deadline the 21st day from sentencing or the 20th? I said the 21st, which gives me 11 days from today. She looked at my notes another moment, stood up, put on her coat that was hanging by the door, put on her barn boots without hurrying, and walked outside to the gate. I followed her. She looked at the gray mare's flank, got her hand into the winter coat to press the hair flat, looked at the brand for maybe 2 minutes without saying anything. The light was failing, overcast and early dark, and I held the lantern close when she needed it. When she was done, she walked back inside and told me to sit down. She said, "The regional certifying office. That's what you need. Not the county registry, the territorial brand certifying office that processes original registrations. When you first register a brand in this territory, the regional office gets a copy of the original sketch before it goes into the county book. It's kept in the regional record indefinitely. If your brand was registered 11 years ago and you have the original certification number, the regional office will have the original sketch on file, and it will not match what Odell put in front of that judge." I said, "How do you know that?" She said, "My husband spent 2 years disputing a fence line with the family north of us after they moved a surveyor's stake 8 feet. I learned more about how county records work in those 2 years than I ever wanted to know. Do you have your original brand certification number?" I had it. I had it in my deed box under the floorboard in the bedroom, along with the land deed and the original purchase papers for the property and a few other things that mattered. I said so. She said, "Get it, and let me write the letters because I know how they need to be addressed and I know the name of the chief clerk in the regional office." She moved the ledger books to the side of the table. She said, "Sit down." I rode home and got the certification number and came back inside 2 hours, writing hard both ways. She had ink and paper already set out. We sat at that kitchen table, and she drafted a letter to the regional certifying office, referencing the certification number and requesting a certified copy of the original brand sketch for registration number so-and-so, filed on such and such a date. She drafted a second letter to the appeals judge, to be filed with Whitfield, noting the existence of the regional record and the potential discrepancy with the county registry. She drafted a third letter to a man in the territorial capital, a records examiner who'd helped her late husband with the fence line dispute, and she said, still owed a favor to the memory of the man. All 3 letters in one sitting. Her handwriting was clear and firm, not decorated. She wrote the way she spoke, nothing extra. When I offered to help, she put a second pen in front of me and said, "Copy those addresses onto the envelopes while I seal these." I copied addresses onto envelopes at her kitchen table. It was past 9 o'clock, and she made coffee without being asked and put a cup in front of me without making anything of it. When the letters were sealed and stacked with the lamp set on top so they wouldn't get pushed aside, She sat back across the table from me. The stove was settling. Outside there was wind in the trees. She said, "Do you still have the rope?" I said, "What rope?" She said, "The one they used on you. I heard they returned it when they let you out." I said, "It's on my saddle." She said, "Throw it in the creek on your way home." I didn't say anything. She said, "Not because of what it means to them, because of what you'll do to yourself carrying it. Throw it in the creek." I looked at her. She said, "I've known what you were doing in this valley for years. You were a careful man who built something right. That's not a small thing. Most men don't do it. Most men take the short way or take what isn't theirs or find some easy place to stand and call it standing. You didn't do any of that." I said, "A lot of good it did me." She said, "It did you a great deal of good. The trouble was Lester Boone, not you, and those are not the same trouble." I sat there with the coffee cup in my hands. She said, "The whole valley knows what you've built out there. They may not be willing to say it in front of Odell, but they know it. That knowing doesn't go away just because a judge read the wrong thing out of a doctored book." I said, "It feels like it does." She said, "I know it does, but it doesn't." It was the plainest thing anyone had said to me since October. I sat with it. Outside, the wind moved through the trees and came down off the ridge the way it does in November, the particular cold of this valley that I'd been living inside for 11 years, and that had tried to push me out. She said, "Go home. Ride the letters to the regional post yourself tomorrow morning if it makes you feel better. It's 12 miles, but you'll make it and back before dark." I said, "You said you'd ride them." She said, "I said I know when I go to town, which is Thursday. You have 11 days and you want to move faster than Thursday." I said, "Then I'll ride them in the morning." She said, "Good. And go home and sleep if you can." She said it the way you'd say it to someone you actually expected it to work on. I went home. I threw the rope in the creek. I don't know if I slept that night, but I remember the sound of the water taking the rope, a soft sound, not dramatic, and I stood there on the bank for a minute listening to the creek run, and then I went back to the house. The response from the regional certifying office came back in 7 days. 7 days, which left 4 days before the appeal deadline. I think about that sometimes, the gap between 7 and 11, and how if even one thing had slowed down, one relay horse changed out late, one clerk busy with something else, it would have been a different story. The regional office had my original brand certification on file, Rafter C, registration number matching the number in my deed box, filed 11 years prior, signed by the certifying clerk. The sketch in that file showed my brand, the long top bar, not the altered version in the county registry. The letter also noted, in language that was professionally careful and therefore clearly written by someone who understood the implication, that the regional certification was the original legal document of record for brand registration, and that any discrepancy between it and a county registry entry would constitute an irregularity requiring investigation. The letter from the Territorial Records Examiner arrived the following morning, and was less careful. He wrote like a man who was annoyed, which I appreciated. He said plainly that the sketch in the county registry had been altered by a competent hand after the original filing, that the alteration was visible under close examination of the paper, and that he intended to forward his findings to the Territorial Attorney General's office as a matter of course. Whitfield took both letters to the appeals judge the same day. The appeals judge, a man from Benton named Carr, not the original judge, which was important, ordered an immediate examination of the horses still held at the Boone spread. He sent his own examiner, not Odell's deputy. His own man, a brand inspector named Sutter who worked out of the territorial office and had no connection to anything in Cutter's Bend. Sutter reported that the horses bore altered brands consistent with a hot iron applied over an existing mark. He noted that the angle and depth of the underlying original brand, visible on 3 of the horses where the overbranding had been done quickly, and without enough heat to fully obliterate what was beneath, matched the regional certification record precisely. He also noted, as a secondary observation, that the overbranding had been done within the past 2 months, not years, which the condition of the scar tissue established clearly. The conviction was vacated. All 15 horses were ordered returned to my custody. Odell was suspended pending a further investigation that, within 2 months, became a formal proceeding involving the county board and the territorial attorney's office. The young deputy who'd brought my meals without looking at me testified in that proceeding, as it turned out. I heard later that he'd been the one to note the date discrepancies in Odell's report, noticed them the first time he read the document, and held onto it for weeks before the territorial examiner gave him a proper reason to say something. I don't know what that cost him, sitting on it that long, but he said it when it mattered. Lester Boone was served with a civil complaint, and from what reached me through various channels over the following year, paid a settlement that kept him out of criminal proceedings and cost him the East spread and more besides. He sold what was left within 18 months and relocated somewhere east of the territory. I didn't ask where. I don't think about him much. A man like that is a problem you deal with and then put somewhere out of the way where it won't use up any more of your time. The other thing that happened in the weeks after the vacated conviction and before I got the horses back, people started showing up at my gate, not Odell's men, neighbors. The feed merchant Garrett came out on a Wednesday morning with a sack of grain he said I was owed on account, which wasn't true. I didn't have credit running with him, but I took it anyway because he needed to do something with his hands. 2 men from the North Valley came by together, brothers who ran a cattle operation, and said they were sorry they hadn't spoken at the hearing. I said, "I know you had reasons." They nodded and didn't explain the reasons, and I didn't ask. The land recorder's clerk Peake wrote me a letter, not in his official capacity, that said simply, "I should have helped you sooner." I don't know what he knew or how long he'd known it. I kept the letter, not as evidence, just to remind myself that even in a valley that stays quiet when it should speak, there are men who feel the weight of their own silence afterward. None of that gave me back 3 horses. None of it returned 6 weeks of my life. But I noted it, and I kept it separate from the anger, which was its own thing and needed its own handling. I got my horses back on a Tuesday morning in early December. 11 of the 15, 3 had died while in Boone's keeping, causes listed as respiratory illness, which I didn't press because there was only so much I could carry at once, and the legal fight was over. 1 more was lame in the right foreleg from standing on bad footing in a poorly maintained paddock, which healed by March. The stud was the stud, barely affected, still that particular presence, that way of holding his head. The gray mare with the overbranded flank came out of the Boone paddock looking at me like she was mildly irritated about the whole thing and was prepared to move on. I rode them home myself. 11 horses on a lead line in December cold, their breath coming off them in a cloud that hung in the still air, frost on the grass where the sun hadn't reached, my own barn coming up through the bare-branched cottonwoods. It was not a triumphant morning. There was nothing to cheer about with 3 of them gone and 1 still limping. It was just quiet, just animals going back to where they were supposed to be, with the man who was supposed to be there with them. I put them in the corral and stood at the rail and looked at them for a while. The young stud walked the fence line already, that same deliberate pace, like he'd been doing it in his head the whole time he was gone and was just getting back to it. The gray mare went straight to the water trough and drank for a long time, which told me about the water quality at Boone's place. The lame one, a bay gelding I'd raised from a foal, stood with his weight off the right fore in the particular quiet of a horse that has learned to manage pain over a stretch of time. I went in and ran my hands down his leg, and he didn't flinch until I got to the fetlock joint, which told me the damage was there and not higher. A farrier's problem, a winter's rest, maybe both. I went about my work. Fed them, watered them, checked the corral for anything loose or sharp that needed fixing while I was in the bad months. I cleaned out the stalls that had been empty since October, which was a particular kind of work, cold and dusty and quiet, and I didn't rush through it. At dusk I came in and made something to eat and sat at the table and thought about nothing specific for a while, which was the first time in 2 months I'd been able to do that. Nora came the following Saturday. She rode up to the gate in the mid-morning, and I saw her coming from the east window and went out to meet her. She had a pot tied in a canvas sack across the saddle, venison stew, she said, because she'd gotten a deer the previous week, mentioned as simply as if she were reporting the weather. She tied her horse, I opened the gate and she came in. We ate in the kitchen with the stove going and the light coming through the east window. She asked about the lame horse, which one, how bad, how it was managed, and I told her. She asked the right questions, the way you do when you've actually worked with injured horses and you're interested in what you're hearing, not performing interest. After a while she asked how many I'd gotten back and I told her 11, and about the 3, and she said, "I'm sorry about those 3, just that, not more." After a bit I told her what I'd thought about, in that back room with the bolt on the outside. I told her about the loneliness of it, which I hadn't told anyone, not the anger, which people expected and which was easier to explain. The loneliness, the specific thing that happened when I stood in that courtroom and looked at every face, and there wasn't one man who stood up. She listened. She didn't try to improve it or put a different frame around it or tell me I'd proven them all wrong in the end, which was true but wasn't what I was saying. She listened and then she said, "I thought about coming to the hearing. I want you to know that. I had it worked out what I'd say, how I'd say it, but I didn't have anything that would have helped you that day. All I had was my word that you were a straight man, and a judge with Odell standing next to him wasn't going to weigh my word against a doctored registry. I needed to find the thing that would work in the room that mattered, and that wasn't the hearing room. So I waited." I said, "You found it." She said, "You found it. You came to me with the gray mare and your certification number and the groundwork already laid. I just knew which door to knock on." I said, "You wrote 3 letters at your kitchen table at 9 o'clock at night." She said, "I know how to write letters." I looked at her. The afternoon light had moved across the kitchen floor while we'd been sitting there, the way it does in December, everything at low angles. There was a sparrow on the windowsill outside for a moment, and then it was gone. I said, "You wrote to the regional office, and the appeals judge, and a man in the capital who owed you a favor. You rode 12 miles to the post before Thursday because you said I'd want it to move faster than Thursday." She said, "You did want it to move faster." I said, "I did, and I want you to know that I understand what that was." She looked at me and didn't deflect it, which was what I appreciated about her. She took things in directly, didn't move away from them. I said, "I need to tell you something, and I'm going to tell it straight. In that back room, in 3 days of going through everything, the brand, the horses, the registry, Boone, Odell, all of it in the end, when I'd gone through all of that until I'd worn it flat, what I kept coming back to, I don't know what to call it except your face. Not because I knew you well enough for that to make sense at the time. I couldn't explain it then and I can't now. I just know that it was there." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I watched you build what you built in this valley for 4 years. Since Henry died and I started paying closer attention to everything. You kept your fences right. You ran your animals without cutting corners. When the Morrison spread was in trouble 2 winters back, you didn't try to buy the east parcel cheap, which Lester Boone did try. I noticed all of it, not because I was watching you in particular, but because I noticed things and you were worth noticing." I said, "What are you saying?" She said, "I'm saying that I was angry when they took you out of this valley, personally angry, not just on the side of what's right, though that too. I was angry because I thought, that is a man this valley needs, and the valley is too corrupt or too scared to say so, and I am not willing to let that stand without doing something about it." I said, "Is that all you're saying?" She turned her cup in her hands. The stove knocked once. She said, "No, it's not all." She said it simply, looking at the table, and then she looked up at me. She said, "I don't move fast and I don't move without knowing my own mind. But I know my own mind on this, and I've known it since the hearing. You can take your time with it, but I want you to know it's there." I said, "I don't need much time, Nora." She held my look. Outside the window the light was late and gold, what you get in December out here when the air is clear and the sun is low. One of the mares shifted in the corral. I could hear the young stud somewhere behind the barn, his particular walk on the frozen ground, that deliberate tread. I said, "I came back here because I still had land and horses here, and I told myself that was the only reason. And it was true, or mostly true. But in that room, after I'd gone through everything practical until there was nothing left, you were there. I don't know what else to call that." She said, "I'd call it enough." I said, "So would I." That's where it started, not with any ceremony about it. We just sat there in the late December light in my kitchen with the stove going and the mares in the corral, and said what we meant. We moved slowly, both of us. She had her spread to run and I had mine, and neither of us was young enough to treat practicality as the enemy of what we wanted. But practicality wasn't what it was, either. It was something slower and more deliberate than that. We rode fence lines together in January because I needed eyes on the north boundary I'd neglected while I was gone, and she knew that section of country better than I did. It bordered her land on the east. She rode with me on a cold, clear Saturday, and we found 2 posts that had heaved in the freeze and a section of wire that had rusted through at the staples. We worked on it together without a lot of conversation. She handed me things and held the wire when I needed it and didn't stand back to watch. She worked alongside. There's a particular thing about a person who can do that, who knows when to talk and when just to hand you the tool, and I noticed it. We had supper twice at her place in February and once at mine. The suppers were ordinary food and conversation about the valley and the winter and the stock, the kind of talking that ranchers do when they sit down together and have a lot of shared practical ground, and also not ordinary at all. The second supper at her place she told me about Henry, her husband, more than she'd told me before, not the grief of it but the man himself, how he'd worked, what he'd thought about, a story about him losing an argument with a mule that made her laugh in the way of someone remembering something good. I listened and didn't try to fill the space after. She said, "He would have thought you were all right." I said, "I'll take that." She said, "You should." By March I was helping with the difficult calving, the one cow she had who always had trouble, a big roan who was reliable in every other way and unreliable about this. We spent a night in the barn taking turns at it, sleeping in the hay in our coats, and in the morning she made coffee on the small camp stove she kept in the barn exactly for this purpose. There was something about that, the camp stove, that she'd put there because she planned for the hard night and didn't complain about it, and we sat on overturned buckets and drank it while the calf found its legs. The roan was already cleaning it, satisfied with herself. Nora said, "You're staying in this valley." I said, "I am." She said, "Good." I said, "I'm not going to talk around what I want. I'm too old for that kind of time wasting." She said, "You're not old." I said, "I'm old enough that I know what matters, and I don't see the sense in pretending otherwise." She looked at me over her cup. The calf behind her was standing now, shaky but upright. The morning light was coming in through the barn doors at a low angle, that particular gold you only get in the early hours when the air is still cold and the sun is new. She said, "I'm not pretending otherwise. I told you I know my own mind." I said, "Then I'd like to marry you." She didn't say it back immediately. She looked at me, took me in, actually looked, the way she did everything, thorough and without hurry, and then she said, "Yes." Just yes. Nothing around it. We married in April. Small wedding, her 2 daughters, A woman friend of hers from the north end of the valley, my lawyer Whitfield, who'd become a better man than his mustache suggested, and the minister from the church in town who'd said nothing in my defense at any point, and seemed to understand that officiating at this wedding was the least he could do. We held the supper at my place. Her daughters, Maura, who was 20, and Clara, who was 17, helped with the food and were polite in the careful way of young women who are watching to see what their mother has chosen and why. Maura found me in the barn before supper. I was checking the gray mare's water, which didn't need checking. I was in the barn because I needed a minute of quiet before going back to the house full of people. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust, and then walked to the stall rail and stood next to me and said, "My mother doesn't do things she doesn't mean. I want you to understand that." I said, "I know it." She said, "My father was a straight man. She chose him the same way, eyes open." I said, "He raised a daughter who speaks plain. That's a good thing." She looked at the gray mare for a moment. Then she said, "Don't disappoint her." I said, "I've got no intention of that." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to the kitchen. I leaned on the stall rail and listened to the house, the sound of voices and Clara's laugh and something being moved in the kitchen, and I thought about the particular shape of the last 6 months. October and the storm and the open gate, the back room with the bolt, Whitfield's mustache, 3 days of going through it until I'd worn the thing flat, the gray mare's flank and the certification number, and Nora's kitchen table at 9 o'clock. I'd been a man who built something careful and honest for 11 years, in a valley that mostly left me alone to do it, which was all I'd wanted. Then the valley had tried to take it, and the valley had failed, but not because the valley suddenly found a conscience. Because one woman had a desk and a pen, and knew which door to knock on, and because a territorial records examiner in the capital was annoyed enough to write a letter that read like a man who'd had enough of what he was seeing, and because a young deputy had held a piece of information in his pocket for weeks until he had someone worth giving it to. That's how things actually get saved, not in a courtroom with a speech, not by the right man walking in at the right moment like something in a novel, by a woman writing 3 letters at a kitchen table late at night because she decided this was worth her time. The gray mare pushed her nose at my coat, looking for something I didn't have. Outside through the barn door, the east pasture was green in April, the fence line I'd kept for 11 years standing straight, the stud out there moving along it with that deliberate walk, measuring the boundary of everything he considered his, which was the same boundary I'd fenced. I'd built this string once. I'd lost 15 of them and gotten 11 back, 3 gone that I carry, 1 who limped through winter and came right in spring. The stud, unchanged. The gray mare, mildly put out by the whole affair. I'd stood in a courtroom and heard a sentence that was supposed to end what I'd spent 11 years making. And here I was on the other side of it, with the horses in the pasture and the supper going, and a woman in the house who'd written 3 letters at 9 o'clock at night and ridden 12 miles to the post before Thursday. The 3 who died in Boone's keeping, I carry that. You don't set that down. A man who owned those animals for years and knew them by name and habit and the set of their ears doesn't put that down. But what you do with what you carry is your own business, and I'd made mine. Nora came to the barn door. She was wearing the blue dress from the ceremony, her hair still up, and she looked at me the way she'd been looking at me since November, direct, no uncertainty in it, the look of a woman who has decided something and doesn't revisit her decisions. She said, "Supper's ready." I said, "Coming." I walked out of the barn toward the house, and she held the door open, and I went past her into the lamplight and the warmth and the smell of food, and she came in behind me, and her hand went to my back, just her palm, flat, between my shoulders, the same plainness as the hand on my shoulder in the cold outside the gate 4 months ago, and I felt it the whole way through me. That's the thing about a good woman who chooses you straight. She doesn't make a performance of it every time. She doesn't need to. She puts her hand there, and you know what it means, that she sees the same man she saw in November and in the barn in March and in her kitchen when she said yes, and she's not uncertain about him. That she chose him plain with her eyes open, the same way she does everything, and she's not going anywhere. The stud in the east pasture, the gray mare with the over-branded flank, Mara in the barn doorway telling me not to disappoint her mother, the supper getting cold. All of it the same evening, my land, my horses, my wife. The rope is in the creek somewhere east of the property line, and I don't think about it. What I think about is the sound the barn door makes in the morning when Nora comes out to help with the horses, that particular creek, just this barn, just this door, and the way the gray mare lifts her head when she hears it. The mare knew her before I'd caught all the way up. Animals know. They know what a person is before you've finished working it out yourself. 11 years to build the string. 3 days in a room with a bolt on the outside. 11 horses walking home in December cold. 1 April morning with a woman who said yes and meant it. That's the whole count of it. That's how it added up.